build a genuine 21st century movement for sustainability in the United States, we need a new story about race and class in our cities. A genuine movement for sustainability must include not only the environment, not only the economy, but the 3 E's: the environment, the economy, and social equity. It must include the stories and the leadership, the aspirations not only of those who are well off, but of those who are most vulnerable and marginalized.
Racial equity to me is fundamental to sustainability. It's a question where I think you have to go back to what's the definition of sustainability. Sustainability is about how all of these different components work together to create prosperous, livable, and equitable communities, ones that are in balance with one another. Sustainability represents this idea that has been around for millennia, that we've somehow forgotten in our economic progress, and so it's a reclaiming of balance.
Since 2004, the Seattle Race and Social Justice Initiative has extended the city's efforts towards both sustainability and racial equity. In September 2014, Seattle was recognized by the Star Community Rating System as the nation's most sustainable city. Julie Nelson and Glenn Harris have worked together for 8 years in city government and were both leaders in Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative. In this video, Glenn and Julie will share the history of the initiative, outline some key accomplishments, and reflect on strategic lessons.
Although Seattle has a reputation of being one of the most livable cities in the country, the truth is when it comes to race, Seattle has the same disparities as you would find anywhere in the country, sometimes worse. Whether we're talking about education, whether we're thinking about incarceration rates, housing options and housing choice, we see that in any key social indicator of health and well-being, that race still matters.
These figures are distressing, but they are similar to the disparities we find in most cities, and in the country in general. The question is, how did these inequalities come to be? How did we get here?
The important thing to remember is that the forms of racial segregation, domination, inequality we see today are simply not possible without the very active participation, leadership, and power of government. You can see this across every issue. So in housing, for example, the government actively and deliberately worked with private realtors and homeowners to require that in urban neighborhoods especially, housing be built and developed on an explicitly segregated basis. That if you lived in an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s and 40s, those neighborhoods went from integrated to segregated because of federal lending policy, local zoning policy, and the enforcement of racially restrictive covenants. You see public school boards building schools to reflect segregated neighborhoods, thus ensuring that those schools will be opened and operated as segregated public institutions. Local cities investing and committing certain forms of law enforcement resources, concentrating them in some areas and not others, ensuring that some communities would send large numbers of their children into the criminal justice system while others would essentially be exempt from those laws. You see it in zoning laws where the industry and the business and the commerce that's essential to the development of many cities, the byproducts of that, the waste that's created by that, the effects of it, are only borne in some areas. Public job training programs, employers would make a request for a racially specified job listing, and a city agency would help fulfill that. That continued well into the 1950s and 1960s. Patterns of contracting for really, really valuable public contracting services also afforded on a racially segregated and unequal basis. So essentially, it's a deep, deep investment in white people across much of the 20th century that builds up a huge inheritance of wealth in white communities, unevenly spread to be sure, but nonetheless transferred to white communities, that absolutely explains the deep disparities in wealth by race we see today.
So given these disparities, community pressure ultimately led the city itself to take on actions to address, eliminate, and mitigate what racial inequity actually looked like in the community.
When Greg Nickels was elected mayor in 2001, one of his first long-range plans was founding a race and social justice initiative with a goal of ending institutional racism within city government.
I think that personal commitment on my behalf as the leader of the city, on the behalf of my cabinet members, my department heads, and holding them accountable for that, but then also a personal commitment on behalf of the employees throughout the city of Seattle to recognize and day by day address the issues of racism.
When we started the Race Social Justice Initiative in Seattle, number one, we had to normalize conversations about race. We knew that as city government that people weren't used to talking about race within their jobs. Number two, we knew we had to change behaviors and we had to work on policies, practices, and procedures that were actually perpetuating inequities. We also had areas where there were similarities across departments. So we knew that every single department was working on workforce equity, contracting equity, outreach and public engagement. These were common areas of concern across departments. And so we formed interdepartmental teams. What we needed to see is outcomes that were different, that we were actually eliminating racial inequities. And that meant that we were all aligned and moving in the same direction with the same vision.
So don't want to mislead you. The truth is that there were bumps along the way, and there still are. Not a full 100% of all city employees embraced the initiative. There was resistance in many ways. We saw it in the form of fear, anger, just concerns about how much time and capacity folks had for a new initiative. Finally, we also saw it just in disbelief. Many folks who were supportive of the idea of city government taking on equity, but not convinced that it was sincere. So as we moved along, it was really critical that we were constantly thinking about both sustainability, how did we keep momentum, keep the conversation moving forward, but also how did we help folks make sure that we were learning from the places that they were struggling. And so the very first training we did with the mayor's office was not a rollicking success. We encountered fear, we encountered emotion, anger, but ultimately, folks were able to actually get through the conversation, and more importantly, we learned from it. We're ultimately successful in creating a space that allowed folks to not only normalize that conversation around race, but to move into action. Aside from the internal opposition, there's also external opposition. In one instance, a disgruntled employee actually approached Fox News with his concerns about the initiative.
New developments now on a story that we brought you yesterday about the city of Seattle and something it calls the Social Justice Program. Seattle deciding that it will not enforce certain laws and policies that it deems racist for minorities. You are letting race and social justice seep into your decision about whether to pursue these charges at all. It's a law that's on the books, and you've decided basically not to go after it because A, you say you don't have the resources, but B, you're very open about saying you also believe that it's a social justice issue and that it's not fair to African Americans. Are you the person to make that decision?
You bet. This is prosecutorial discretion. You're a lawyer, Megan, and you realize that I have discretion as a prosecutor to decide how we're going to prioritize our resources. And in this case, it is completely race neutral, the decisions that we make. We simply ask the Seattle Police Department to bring all of these cases directly to my office. We review them on the basis of race neutral criteria.
Right, on an individual basis, I grant that to you. It is race neutral. Once it's been brought to you, you don't say this guy's getting off because he's black and this guy's not going to get off, he's going to get charged because he's white.
Absolutely.
But you made a decision
That's
to only prosecute or pursue the charges in 10% of the cases because you believe it has a disparate impact on minorities. And normally, as you know, when you believe a law has a disparate impact, you challenge it. You can challenge that law as unconstitutional and then get a court to declare it as having a disparate impact, and then it's done. You don't just say, I'm no longer going to enforce it.
That's typically what a defender would do, Megan, not a prosecutor. I have prosecutorial discretion. I can simply decide which cases we're going to charge. And in this case, it furthers public safety and also furthers a race and social justice initiative, the winning combination.
Okay, now, fair enough. That's where you stand on it. I would appreciate the clarification.
So while there has been some opposition over the course of the initiative has now grown and thrived for over a decade. What we find is that 86% of employees think that it's important to use a racial equity lens within their own jobs. 9 out of 10 community members think that racial equity should be a priority of government. An example of that, ban the box. Using criminal background checks within job application processes. A group of women from the Sojourner Place homeless shelter approached the Office for Civil Rights with all sorts of barriers that they were facing. They'd go to apply for jobs, and when they had to check that box, they couldn't get a job. We initially started working with them on an across-the-board ban the box initiative. We found, however, that the city was doing the same thing in our own job application processes. And so we took it a step at a time. Before we started working with the private sector, we changed our own policy around use of criminal background checks. Then we started working with the private sector, got ban the box legislation passed across the board. Incorporating racial equity into the comprehensive planning process just provided huge traction for us to make sure that our city is a sustainable city that supports racial equity.
Pramila Jayapal, veteran immigrant rights activist and now Washington State Senator, reflects on her first reactions to the Seattle Race and Social Justice Initiative.
The city had just announced that it was starting this Race and Social Justice Initiative. I was invited to come in and talk about the work that we were doing around immigrant rights, around how the lives of immigrants in Seattle were being affected, and why people should care. I was invited to go back and speak to other departments, and I remember being somewhat skeptical. As a person of color in the community facing discrimination, attacks, hate crimes, racism, it felt like we needed people to hurry up and get to the table. And now I really understand that it had to move very slowly. I think the initiative has made the concept of race and racism very much embedded in how departments look at their work, and the tools, the language, and the connections in the community to do the analysis that's needed when you're initiating a policy initiative, or to actually be able to say we are not addressing the unintended consequences of race. That is more and more becoming embedded within the way that departments do things.
It is always a challenge to keep new initiatives going when staff and elected leadership change. Patricia Lally, newly appointed director of the Seattle Office of Civil Rights, provides some insights on how a new team of leaders has stayed the course and expanded the initiative's scope of work.
In April of 2014, the mayor signed a new executive order regarding the Race and Social Justice Initiative. He actually took the initiative further and developed it to a more comprehensive level. The mayor said, I want all departments to use the Racial Equity Toolkit. I want a racial equity analysis in all of our budget proposals. I want accountability also in the community. He instructed our office to ensure that the community were partners in racial equity.
The key components of the initiative were to normalize, organize, operationalize, and then assess the work. What we mean by normalize is to make sure that we're all sharing similar definitions and that we have a similar understanding of the issues that we're talking about. We're not necessarily naming agreement, but we are saying that it's important that we are all on the same page.
For too long, we have acted as if racial inequities are the norm. They are not the norm. They have been intentionally created and maintained over the course of this country's history. For us to get to different outcomes, we have to be able to increase this work as a priority, and we have to operate with urgency.
What we mean by organize is really thinking both internally and externally, meaning we need a strategy that helps bring folks together to move for change, internal to city government, and also external to community in supporting their efforts for change.
We have an inside-outside strategy. Within government, we are organizing within the institution. However, we also know that even if government was doing everything it could and should be doing, we'd still have racial inequity in the community. It's not enough to organize within government. We also have to work with the community so that we're actually having the greatest impact in eliminating racial inequities.
To operationalize this work means literally to use racial equity tools that allow us to analyze policy and practice, and to use data in a way that allows us to think about measurement and outcome, that provides at its core a methodology and a set of resources to allow us to come to a solution on how we get to racial equity.
We also have got to be using data to actually drive to better results. That too often we see report after report that documents disproportionality, but what we don't see is people using that data to develop strategies that will get us to different results, and will track our progress over the course of time.
Assessment is critical to all aspects of thinking about how we create change. As we go through the process of organizing, normalizing conversations around race, and operationalizing how we actually get to different outcomes, it's essential that we're thinking about how we assess each of those phases and their relationship to each other. That means not only thinking about the quantitative data, are we having successes that are measurable, but also are we actually talking about qualitatively what are people's experience as we're going through those processes. Assessment allows us to revise, reinforce, and replicate success.